One of the most common experience that I had as a non-theist, if not straight up insults or condescension, is actually being offered with God arguments. It could come with many forms, as a proposition where people propose to me arguments such as cosmological argument or anything like that, or making flat-out assertions such as, if God doesn't exist, then who creates us? Remember, if there is cow dung, there must be cow, or the most classic, if you don't believe in God, where do your morality comes from? Now, I don't have any problems with all of this. It comes within the territory of being an outspoken non-theist. But you have to understand, these assertions only annoy me, as I already hear everything that they said, and frankly, unlike them who just asserting, I also already analyzed those assertions. I know where do those arguments come from and how the formations came to be. Hi, my name is Fuad and welcome to Philosophy, where we discuss hot takes on analytical philosophy of religion, Nusantaran history, and a little bit of music. In this video, I'm going to inform you the Greek influence behind some of your favorite God arguments and theologies, and give you my philosophical takes on the fact. My goal in this video is to show you how hard it is to convince people with arguments when that people is not only knowledgeable on that arguments, but also clearly understood the underlying history, motives, and evolution of the arguments. As always, the caveats are, when I say Abrahamic here, I refer to the Abrahamic religion, which are Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. This video is not necessarily refuting religion, it's more of a blend of history and philosophy. However, I will confidently say that the nature of this video is a rejection of religion. There will be high theology and philosophy words here. This is not an entry-level philosophy video. I'm not a scholar of neither philosophy nor theology, so take this video, as always, with a heap of salt. So yeah, let's get philosophical. Let's start with the classic, cosmological argument. Everything that began to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. This is a very simple clean-cut deductive argument, and to which we will see in the following discussions, make a very big claim about the true state of the universe using nothing but pure rationalization. But unlike the other following arguments, this argument is special because it developed alongside it the idea of causation, change, contingency, and finitude, something that's still philosophically and even scientifically relevant up into the modern days. The most popular form of cosmological argument, of course, the Kalam cosmological argument, which proposed by Dr. William Lane Craig, the philosopher and apologist of evangelical Christianity. It uses the Big Bang hypothesis as an evidence of the second premise, which consequently made the arguments become one hell of a convincing case. Funny, isn't it? Despite philosophy and theology insistence of the fallibility of science, they still rely on that science to make a good case for their argument. But anyway, to conclude, the modern conception of cosmological argument is empirical, concerned in an issue of temporality, which is the beginning of the universe, does work within the finite universe framework, and of course, stubbornly attach the monotheistic God to its conclusion. But do you know the original form of this argument, or anything but? We find the first conception of cosmological argument in the writing of Aristotle, a 4th century BCE Greek philosopher and my own personal goat. In his book Metaphysics, Book 12, he said that there is something which moves without being moved, being eternal substance and actuality. And in his book Physics, Book 8, he said that if everything that is in motion is moved by something, there must be a first mover. Aristotle argued that everything in motion is moved by something else. Nothing moves itself in the primary sense. This creates a chain of movers. An infinite regress of movers is impossible. Therefore, there must be a first unmoved mover, a being that causes motion without itself being moved. This unmoved mover is eternal, immaterial, and pure actuality, and is identified with God. What's interesting here is, Aristotle's arguments talk about movements, not temporality as conceptualized in KCA. Aristotle also thinks of God in a very different sense than what the Abrahamics do now. Aristotle's gods, roughly speaking, is understood as a prime mover, one which initiates all motion without being moved itself, one which detached from the physical world, does not know about human affairs, nor does it have a plan for mankind, and noesis noeseos, or a pure intellect that only thinks about itself. Now, obviously, this idea then being imported all the way into the medieval Islamic world, finding some improvement through the minds of Al-Ghazali, who developed the Kalam cosmological argument, to which Dr. Craig later adopted. Shout out to both of them for using this cool argument and give it a very badass name. The other version that we can see developed with the medieval Islamic world is Ibn Sina's contingency argument. Contingent being, things that could fail to exist, require explanation. The totality of contingent beings cannot explain itself. Therefore, there must be a necessary being. This necessary being exists by necessity and grounds all contingent existence. Next up, we have the teleological argument or the fine-tuning argument or argument from design. In the modern times, it argues that the universe is finely tuned, so much so if even a single teeny tiny disruption in cosmological constants could not only make life fail to exist, but also the universe. Just like the cosmological argument, the modern formation of the argument relies so much on scientific data. Not there's anything wrong with that, mind you. But here's the thing. What the argument suggests about the cosmological constant is correct. The universe behaved in a seemingly fine-tuned manner, as if there is someone or something that sustains it all. The first ideation of this argument came from Plato, a teacher and later arch-nemesis of Aristotle, which made him also my arch-nemesis by association. In his book Timaeus, Plato described the cosmos as the product of a rational craftsman or the demiurge who imposes order on chaos. Timaeus describes the demiurge as unreservedly benevolent, and so it desires a world as good as possible. The result of his work is a universe as a living god with lesser gods, such as the stars, planets, and gods of the traditional religion inside it. Although a fashioner, the demiurge is not necessarily the same as the creator figure in the monotheistic sense, because the demiurge itself and the material from which the demiurge fashions the universe are both considered consequences of something else. The word demiurge is an English word derived from demiurgus. It was originally a common noun meaning craftsman or artisan, but gradually come to mean producer and eventually creator. Aristotle further systematized teleology through his doctrine of the four causes, particularly the concept of the final cause, which explains the purpose or end towards which a thing is directed. For Aristotle, teleology is intrinsic to nature itself. Natural entities behave in goal-directed ways without requiring external imposition by a designer. Just like how the cosmological argument becomes empirical in the modern times, so does the teleological. The difference, however, with the conception of demiurge, the idea of personal God could flourish in the following decades into something more concrete and worship-worthy. I gotta give it to my man Plato. He clearly had more imagination than Aristotle. Nowadays, the teleological argument was reformulated in response to philosophical and scientific critics. Rather than presenting design as a deductive proof, contemporary philosophers often frame it as an inductive or probabilistic argument. This version suggests that the existence of order and complexity in the universe is more probable under the hypothesis of design than under chance or necessity. This shift reflects broader trends in philosophy towards probabilistic reasoning and away from claims of certainty, just like what I stated at the very beginning of this part. Yay for analytic philosophy! Before we conclude this elaboration with Aquinas, let's briefly discuss moral argument, the one that I extremely, almost unreasonably despise. I mean, how can you not? This argument centers itself so much towards human experience. It's as if the God they're thinking of is merely a projection of some kind of ideal human. Anyway, in the modern version, it goes like this. The existence of objective morality proves that there are moral lawgiver. God is the moral lawgiver, therefore God exists. This argument presupposes that God is in some way a groundings for morality, either as a moral lawgiver or as a metaphysical grounding of morality itself, aka God is the good. Now, without evaluating the quality of this argument, let's tackle how the Greek formed their understanding of this kind of moral groundings. The idea of the good God could be traced back to, you've guessed it, Plato. In his book Republic, Plato argued that moral values are objective and grounded in the form of the good, an abstract and ultimate standard of morality. This form of the good is not identical to any kind of personal God, but more of a metaphysical foundation for morality. It's almost like the causal law in comparison. If you see all the conclusions that these arguments made, almost none of them look like what the Abrahamics conclude for. While the Abrahamics conclude a personal, all-powerful creator agent, the Greeks' conclusions are disjointed. They are impersonal, not necessarily good, and not even a creator agent, let alone an agent. So, when was the time the conclusion of these arguments started to take agency? Well, we have to go to the era of Neoplatonists in 2nd century CE. Within this time frame, a dude named Plotinus, a big fan of Plato, proposed a hierarchical metaphysics, the one or the ultimate source, intellect, and soul. Not gonna lie, got a very strong Trinity vibes here. Anyway, Plotinus proposed that all reality emanates from the one, which is necessary, simple, the source of all existence, including the goodness itself. From this point on, the foundation of associating the conclusions that the Greeks made with their arguments into a very personal and conscious entity had already been thought of, and before you know it, it did influences the Christians. For example, Saint Augustine of Hippo, to which we'll feature him more prominently later, developed an idea of moral goodness with participation in God. Evil was understood as a privation of good, reinforcing the idea that morality depends on a divine source. How convenient. Moving on, I'm not going to discuss the ontological argument here, as that kind of argument was conceived at the time of Anselm, which was in medieval, heavily Christian Europe, almost 17 centuries after the Greeks. As we explained at the previous part, the cosmological argument were extensively developed in the Islamic Golden Age era, before all of these arguments being culminated by the one and only Saint Thomas Aquinas, the legendary 13th century Catholic philosopher, the bridge between the classical Greek philosophy and the modern philosophy and the apologetics culture. Anyway, in his book Summa Theologiae, he synthesized the cosmological ideas, particularly the argument from motion, efficient cause, and contingency, arguing that God is the unmoved mover in all of its conclusion. He also argues in teleological framework that non-intelligent natural entities act towards end, and such goal-directed behavior must be guided by an intelligent being. Finally, he also developed natural law theory, arguing that moral laws are grounded in human nature. Human reason can discover them, they ultimately derive from God's eternal law. Now, to be fair, I don't read his books and have a very little understanding of Thomistic philosophy, despite he's the one who brought back the long-lost Aristotelian philosophy into the West. Side note, I still think the Islamic Golden Age is cooler because they really delve deep in Aristotelian philosophy. Shout out to those persons, they made Aristotelian cool again. Anyway, but I can confidently say that ultimately, the culmination of this conclusion into the Abrahamic monotheistic God that we understood today happened at the time of Aquinas. From that point on, the Greeks and their argument were monopolized by the Abrahamics. Now, to the credit of Aquinas, he actually didn't quickly jump into conclusion, saying that the arguments concluded his God's existence. He made more case in the next chapter of his book, The Second Question. So, credit where the credit is due. Now, some scholars within the field of philosophy and or theology will conclude that what the modern theistic philosophers and theologians did was explaining their God through the lens of the Greek. But I beg to differ, because first of all, those Greeks did not even think of a single God. I mean, think about it. What similarity does the demiurge, unmoved mover, and Socrates' hotheos even had? Heck, even Plato's demiurge and form of the good isn't the same being. On the other hand, the metaphysics that these Greeks believe in is, for the most part, also incompatible with the metaphysics that the Abrahamics would require in order for their gods to exist. I know, it's ironic to form a sentence that made God's existence became contingent upon a very specific metaphysical groundings, but here we are. For example, Aristotle believed that the universe is eternal, contrasting that with Dr. Craig's insistence that it's not, which is, of course, a position motivated by his belief. That's why I find it's weird to see modern theologians or apologists lumping up all those ideas into one single God. And you know what? I even think it's not cool. I believe we have to take the ideas on their own merit. Instead of using those ideas as proof for your specific God, why don't you just follow the arguments to where it leads you and try to determine whether it has its own validity or not? Now, this is me personally. I think if you look deeply within those Greeks' writings, there are a lot of struggles and uncertainty there. And I think it's part of its charm. A philosophical idea about the existence of something ultimate supposed to be struggling. It concerns something that we fundamentally unequipped to grasp. It could even be a lifelong struggle of understanding. And I think that's what makes the idea so compelling. It demands mental investments from you. So, to just conclude it all with, your God is lazy and intellectually cheap. The second problem I have is, of course, the classic. These arguments don't conclude to your specific post-classical, post-Hellenistic gods. You still need to provide extra premises as why that these arguments concluding for is either Jesus or Yahweh, Allah, or any other god in particular. Another thing that I find peculiar is, if we see the Greeks' conclusion, they concluded it in a rational manner. There is almost no theology attached, at least to our knowledge. There is no associating to who such entity is specifically, what form it takes, does it have a son, or do we have to worship it in or what way? Does it require any prophet that proclaim its truth, or explain to us why we are sinning or anything? It's just a being concluded by pure rationalization. But okay, that's not my point. My point is, just like how the Abrahamics still have a very long way to convince people that these arguments concluded to is their specific God, they still have to convince us why the theologies that follows are the way it is. I mean, no offense to you Abrahamics, but I find it weird that by conceding to your argument's conclusion, I have to believe things like original sins, talking donkey, God drowning an entire civilization, circumcision, growing your beards, and drinking camel piss. I mean, where's the correlation here? The last problem that I have is the manner in which the argument became prominent in today's discourses. If you pay enough attention, you'll see that the proponent and the opponent of these arguments are finely tuned to the theist and the non-theist respectively. If you see those who agree with the arguments, you'll see people who mostly adhere to the Abrahamic faith with belief in God attached to them by default. And if you see those who disagree, you'll see people who don't adhere to any faith, yet mostly came out from the Abrahamics. I think this is problematic because if your exposure to those ideas are always attached with them labels of theistic inclinations, you cannot see those arguments by their own merit. Just as I said before, these arguments in essence are not necessarily demand theism or non-theism from you. That argument at the very core is a process in which we make sense of existence and perhaps beyond it. And the modern discourse sadly paint a picture as if those arguments are being monopolized or worse, weaponized by the Abrahamics. As if agreeing with those arguments is equal to agreeing to the existence of their God. I mean, I don't see any contradiction of becoming either a non-theist, Buddhist, or polytheist yet agreeing with most of those arguments. Now, of course, I can see the historical reasons for it. First of all, the arguments were developed in the western part of the world, spread across the western part of the world, and then developed by the western thinkers or western influenced thinkers. And since the West were of the Abrahamics, specifically Christianity and Judaism, and since the West are the de facto cultural juggernaut since 5 to 6 centuries ago, thank goodness their influence are waning nowadays, it's no wonder the arguments are always attached with them the idea of Abrahamic religions. I think it just makes sense. In this part, let's see how the Greek influenced the Christian, not merely through their philosophical argumentation, but also deep into their own theology. You might be familiar with ideas such as Jesus Christ as the Logos, immaterial God, and Creatio ex nihilo. Those ideas are quite central within Christian theology and some in Islam. But do you know that these ideas and several other ideas were actually inspired by Greek philosophy? Even the idea of Trinity have strong roots there also. Now, what I'm going to do here is try to elaborate the Greek influence between some of these quite arguably Christians' central doctrine. But bear in mind, I'm not going to elaborate the doctrine of Trinity. As much as I found the doctrine to be silly, I don't want this video to be unnecessarily clipped and used as a polemical attack against Christianity. That's just not my style. Let's start with Jesus Christ as the Logos. This statement was taken from the Gospel of John chapter 1 verse 1. It reads, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." It is now widely understood that the Word, or Logos, understood as Jesus Christ. Theologically, to say that Jesus Christ as the Logos identifies him as the pre-existent, a divine second person of the Trinity. Now, for some of you who's not Christian or familiar with Christian idea, this sounds either highly spiritualistic or makes no sense whatsoever. But bear with me, as Christology is not a discussion we aimed at. We aim, however, at where did the alignment of Logos with Christ began. First of all, the passage doesn't say anything about Logos as Jesus. And secondly, as a concept, Logos is not a concept born from Christianity. Well, at least Christians weren't the first who came up with the idea. It was the Stoics. Literally, Logos means word, discourse, or reason. Philosophically, the first usage of the word Logos was by Heraclitus back in 4th century BCE. The term was referring to a principle of order or knowledge. Within this time, the concept of Logos didn't necessarily have any supernatural to it. It was, for the most part, used literally as what it meant, discourse. The Stoics, however, made a concept called Logos spermatikos, who translated variously as germinal principles, causal principles, primordial reasons, original factors, seminal reasons, seminal virtues, or seed-like principles to express a theological theory on the origin of species. Thus the word seed. From that point on, the idea then adopted by Jewish philosophy through Philo of Alexandria, a Hellenized philosopher Jew. He proposed an idea where he distinguished between Logos proporikos, or the utter word or speaker, Logos spermatikos, the speech, and the Logos endiathitos, the word remaining within. The idea then adopted into Christianity and sealed through the writings of Justin Martyr, who concluded that Jesus Christ as the Logos in his book, First Apology. What's peculiar within this writing is perhaps the nature of it. First Apology, as the name suggests, was made in defense of Christianity. J.M. himself was touted as the first Christian apologist. In there, he argues that Jesus Christ is the incarnation of the Logos, which leads him to the proof that any individual who has spoken with reason, even those who lived before Christ, connected with the Logos in the form of Christ, and is thus, in fact, a Christian. Big claim, I know. In here, he argues that Christianity is a rational philosophy. He remarks at how Christianity can provide moral teaching for its followers and how many of the Christian teachings parallel similar stories in pagan mythology, making it irrational for contemporary pagans to persecute Christians. I don't know, man. I got a big Sutta Soma energy here. Now, it needs to be understood that at this time, Christianity is still not a major religion within the Roman Empire. Thus, things like criticisms, cultural pressure, and persecutions were something that commonly experienced by the Christians. So it's normal for many Christians motivated to define Christianity by ways that acceptable within the Greco-Roman context. The second one is concerning the immaterial God, an idea that God is incorporeal, not anthropomorphic, or put simply, doesn't have body. This idea in modern times were readily understood by many of the Abrahamics across all religion and religious denomination, to the point of imagining God to have any kind of humanly form is absurd and idiotic. But little that they know, the people of the past did think God has a body. If we see how the Old Testament described God, they really think that God has a body, just like humans, only bigger. Much, much bigger. Now, some people might refute, and understandably so, by saying that God is spirit, quoting John 4:24. But the problem is, at least up to early Christianity, spirit was understood as some type of matter. They thought of spirit as conceptually related to wind, something that cannot be hurt with a sword, corrode, nor decompose. It's not a distinction between material and immaterial. It's a distinction between something vulnerable and invulnerable. The change from material and immaterial happened gradually at the times of the Roman Palestine, where Greek philosophy, mainly Platonism, influenced how some of the Christians think of their God. Just like we discussed before, Platonic philosophy, at least in this time frame known as Middle Platonism, think of God as asomatos or incorporeal. They see God as transcendent, immaterial, and supreme rational mind, the highest principle of reality. Ultimately, the idea of incorporeal God is sealed through Origen of Alexandria, an early Christian scholar and theologian at the 2nd century CE. Just like many other of his peers, he was heavily Hellenized, and frankly, he seemed to hate the concept of God having a body because it clashed with his Middle Platonism philosophy. In his book, On First Principles, chapter 1.1, he criticized the early Christians who thought that God had a body by saying, and I quote, "Some persons suppose that God is a body, not understanding that God is of a simple intellectual nature, admitting of no bodily composition." He goes on to argue that attributing bodily form to God is a misunderstanding rooted in taking scriptural language too literally rather than recognizing that God is immaterial and beyond physical properties. I guess literalism is not just a modern problem. Now, this is a doozy one, but get this. First of all, nothing within the scripture say anything about Creatio ex nihilo. Even the first word at the book of Genesis doesn't point out anything about a beginning of time, where there is no time before. Doozy shit, I know. But for the sake of brevity, I'll leave you at that. Anyway, the first notion of ex nihilo stuff, as quoted by many apologists, available at 2 Maccabees 7:28. 2 Maccabees is an apocrypha that composed in Greek by Hellenistic Jews. In verse 28, it says, and I quote, "I beseech you, child, to look towards heaven and earth, and on seeing all that is in them, to know that God did not make these things from what existed, and the human race came into existence the same way." Oh, what a doozy. Lucky me, I'm a scary smart philosopher. Interestingly, the sentence "did not make these things from what existed" comes from the Greek phrase "ok ex onton," which more or less means "from the non-being stuff." This is referring to a traditional Greek philosophical concept most clearly articulated within the Aristotelian traditions that viewed that there seem to be realms of being and non-being. Both realms have matters, but whereas in the realm of being matters have form and function, in the realm of non-beings matters have no form nor function. Yet both the realm of being and non-being exist. So, if we put this framework to the passage, the child this scripture talk about were not created from nothing, but from a realm of non-being into a realm of being where it formed and functioned as a human child, roughly speaking. The conception of Creatio ex nihilo were created during the Greco-Roman Judaism and wouldn't come together until the 2nd century CE, with Gnostics and Greeks put Christians in the position of having to define the concept of creation of the universe. Mind you, the conventional wisdom within the Greco-Roman at that time were ex nihilo nihil fit. Nothing comes from nothing. Shout out to my boy Parmenides. Which means matter cannot be generated from non-existence. Thus, the universe must have always existed in some state or another. Ultimately, Christians from the late 2nd century CE to later developed a response that argued that matter ultimately derived directly from God. God, as written by Tatian in his address to the Greeks, is the source of all matter. Around 180 CE, Theophilus of Antioch, the Patriarch of Antioch, wrote to Autolycus, who said that matter cannot be co-eternal and co-equal with God if God is the creator of and sovereign of all. In the future, Christian powerhouses like Irenaeus, Theophilus, Tertullian, Augustine, and ultimately Aquinas will use the same approach to see those passages, and eventually, the notion of Creatio ex nihilo become the golden standard of Christian and Islamic theology. What from the future here?
I forgot to add this part and I just realized it when I was already in the editing process. Anyway, ultimately, the notion of ex nihilo were deployed as a response, which indicates that it wasn't originally codified, let alone understood as the brute fact of the beginning of the universe. To me, this is rather disappointing, because what makes the Abrahamics sounded intelligent were how similar their understanding of the universe with modern astrophysics, particularly around the notion of the Big Bang. Turns out, I was wrong. The similarities were merely came out as a Popperian coincidence. Their ex nihilo stuff were came out as a response against criticism that, get this, were being launched with zero scientific credence.
Now, with all this data being laid out, what do they tell us? Or at least tell me? Well, I guess whenever I were to be presented with this theology, I couldn't help but ask, how much of those doctrines were born out from the Greek, and where does this born out of Israel? Because obviously, the theologies between the Hebrew Old Testament and the New Testaments are very much different. Even the conception of God is different. Whereas in the Old Testament, God is anthropomorphic, emotional, seems to focus on Israel alone, and loves to give laws. The God in the New Testament, however, is very loving to the point of self-sacrifice. If you add some Greek flavors to it, the New Testament God is immaterial, infinite, all good, and abstract, among others. Now, you can say that this evolution of theology were always intended by God, for whatever reasons. But as someone who's outside of your faith, who coincidentally is quite well versed in Greek philosophy, I will stubbornly ask, well, how do you know that? Because just like any other skeptics who view your religion from the outside lens, I will expect that God in some retrospective way will tell you his intention as a way to validate his plans. The second lens that I want to point out is, most of these conceptions were coming as a response, either as a defense or as internal critic. Had there were no attacks or critic, would the Christian theology be the same? Suppose that we strip away all the teachings of the Greek-influenced forefathers. Would you still understand Jesus as the Logos without Justin Martyr, God as immaterial without Origen and Clement, God as all good without Augustine? And if you can, how? I'd say you cannot. Because if you read the scripture as it is, the idea is non-existent. Now, of course, I'm not claiming that what God is or what theology are is restricted within the scripture. Of course not. But if you were to explain God outside your scripture without any Greek to do the conceptualizing, what are the warrants or the sources that indicates that your God is exactly look like the way it does now? Will the forefathers be like, yeah, the God in Septuagint is anthropomorphic, emotional, reactive, and draconian. So God must be immaterial, impermanent, all-loving, and merciful. Perfectly makes sense. I'd like to conclude this part by quoting Edwin Hatch, an English theologian, Anglican clergyman, and academic, from his book The Influence of Greek Ideas and Usages. It is impossible for anyone, whether he be a student of history or no, to fail to notice the difference of both form and content between the Sermon on the Mount and the Nicene Creed. The Sermon on the Mount is a promulgation of a new law of conduct. It assumes belief rather than formulates them. The theological conceptions which underlie it belong to an ethical rather than a speculative side of theology. Metaphysics are wholly absent. The Nicene Creed is a statement partly of historical fact and partly of dogmatic inferences. The metaphysical terms which it contains will probably have been unintelligible to the first disciples. Ethics have no place in it. The one belongs to the world of Syrian peasants, the other to the world of Greek philosophers. The contrast is patent. If anyone thinks that it is sufficiently explained by saying that one is a sermon and the other is a creed, it must be pointed out in reply that the question why an ethical sermon stood in the forefront of the teaching of Jesus Christ and a metaphysical creed in the forefront of Christianity of the 4th century is a problem which claims investigation. For the last part, let's talk about the modern apologetics. Modern apologetics were unique compared with their older counterparts, and when I first encountered them in 2022, I was fascinated with how seamlessly they incorporate science as the building blocks of their premises. I thought people like William Lane Craig is extremely cool and smart with how he make cosmology, astronomy, mathematics, and history as part of their premises. At first, I thought it was a natural move for them. After all, if the religion is true, it won't in any way contradict science, right? But then I realized something. The deeper I got into the philosophy of religion, I started to notice a pattern that made me quite disillusioned with those apologetics. They didn't employ science as a natural premise of their arguments, but more as a modern reconstruction of their already concluded arguments. Before Darwin, the teleological seemingly laser-focused on the design of human anatomy. Just look at William Paley's watchmaker analogy. But once Darwin came with his theory of evolution, teleological argument waned before it resurfaced in the later era, this time using the seemingly designed universe exactly at the time when astronomy started to become calculable, so to speak. Before Big Bang, any form of cosmological argument, as I stated at the earlier part, was solely discussed the metaphysics. Pay attention, unmoved mover, first cause, necessary being are all metaphysical concepts. But when the Big Bang theory came, Dr. Craig then used that scientific theory as his building block. I think that's a conveniently cunning move, but ultimately deceptive. Because instead of using God to reveal science, he used science to reveal God. And conveniently, it all happened when science already advanced enough to know the universe at large. Personally, I think the only scientific frontier that religion cannot utilize is neuroscience, because it reveals the evolutionary explanations behind our morality, even deep into our empathy and moral instincts. It goes in contradiction with religion since it kinda debunks the free will hypothesis, the existence of souls, and the metaphysical existence of objective moral value. I guess that's why almost all religious people and some philosophers reject this kind of science, because it could debunk religion and take away philosophy's monopoly on the topic of morality, consciousness, and free will.
Yeah, I'm still here. Anyway, with this understanding, I then get the sense that apologetics always follow the same pattern in every era. It employed as a reaction against criticism. Also, the arguments were never arose naturally due to the overwhelming fact of the God that it argues for. Most of the time, the God as the conclusion is only added sloppily without justifying why it should be there at the first place. To quote Family Guy,
"It insists upon itself, Lois.
What?
It insists upon itself."
What does that even mean?
but here's the thing. I never think that the arguments were weak, unconvincing, or even useless. I love those arguments. I think they're valid, and I always position myself as receptive towards the conclusion. That's why I never debunk the argument. I debunk the God conclusion. Because, again, you haven't made enough case, and secondly, I know too well that the original version doesn't have that God conclusion attached there. And as I demonstrate in this video, I know when and why it was attached. To quote the lion Arslan in Narnia,
"Do not cite the deep magic to me, witch. I was there when it was written."
well, I'm not exactly there when it was written because it would make me 2,500 years old or something, but you get the point.
As always, the references I have for this video are listed in the description. Thank you guys. I'll see you in the discussion hall.